Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm glad that you're here to watch Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church's Sunday School. We're making our way through the whole Bible, and now we're up to a very unusual book called the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, or sometimes even the Canticles. So we'll look at some very interesting things about this particular book today. One of the things that I didn't realize until I started studying for this lesson was how popular the Song of Songs or Song of Solomon have been since the early church. So, for example, over the centuries, hundreds of books and commentaries have been written and an unknown number of sermons preached on these 117 verses. There's a commentary by M.H. Pope in the Anchor Bible Commentary series on the Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, from 1977. And Pope's work contains a 55-page bibliography with over 1,000 entries. And even though this is a list of 1,000 books, it is selective with notable omissions, and there are no entries later than 1975. So you realize from that just how popular the Song of Songs has been down through the history of the church. It has been popular both in the Jewish synagogue and in the Christian church. And so one of the things that we can sort of ask ourselves about that is, what causes that, and what's really going on? To make it simple, what's really the deal with this book? It's unusual, it's strange, people have all kinds of different ideas about what's really going on with it, and so we ask ourselves, what's the deal with this book? First of all, the Song of Solomon was not, or Song of Songs, either one, were not allowed to be read by young Jewish boys until after they were age 12. And that's because the book has some fairly explicit scenes of the marriage bed. Now, we'll talk about how these scenes play out and what all is going on in there, but it was recognized by those who were reading the book that this was not suitable for children until they were, of age at least 12 or 14 years old. And this has led to some over-allegorizing the text as a picture either of God's love for Israel or as a picture of Christ's love for the church. There's just this idea among some people, both in the early church and in the church today, that sex is a horrible thing that ought never to be spoken of in the church or in Sunday school or anything like that. It's a very, very different view of what's going on, because when you have this book that is clearly read on the face of it, it's a book about sex. They just don't know exactly how they're supposed to deal with this book, because it seems so strange, and what they're supposed to do with it. So the book can be called the Song of Song of Solomon. It can be called Canticles. We're not certain who wrote it. One of the big questions about the book is at what its date of writing was, and we don't know for certain. The early church and early midrashic rabbis thought that the book was a love song written by Solomon. And there's some reason to believe that may be the case. There have been some arguments that the language of the book is too late. And we talked about this when we talked about some other books. The language of the book is too late, and therefore it couldn't have been written by Solomon. Those arguments have gained less traction lately, and there are some, even non-evangelicals, who are willing to say this is an early written book. These arguments against it being given an early date are simply not nearly as strong as we once thought they were. The interesting thing is that no other book, with the possible exception of Revelation, has so many different types of interpretation. If you've been watching any of the other Sunday school, you've seen my friend David talking about Revelation and Daniel and how they fit together and what's going on. And there are a lot of different ideas about what's going on in Revelation, depending upon what your theological presuppositions are, depending upon what your hermeneutical framework is. There are all kinds of ideas. We find the same sort of thing with this book, the Song of Solomon. Revelation, those problems are caused because it's an apocalyptic book. It's a book that has all kinds of monsters and symbolism and things that we don't always exactly know how to take them. The Song of Solomon, though, is different in that the reason for its problem and reason for problems in the interpretation are not because of the fact that it's apocalyptic or that it's hard to understand. The reason is that it's easy to understand. It's just what it has to say. So there are a variety of different ways that the book has been taken. One of them is allegorical, and that is that this is either a picture of the love between God and Israel, if you were Jewish, or Christ and the church, if you were Christian. And so this argument will say that this book is not about human sex, and it should never be read that way. That's not what it has to say, and it's allegorical. It's telling us a story, but it's a much larger story than of just Solomon and a woman. It's much larger than that. Then there's the Roman Catholic view that often identify the woman with Mary. That could take us far afield, but we won't. You realize, of course, that in the Roman Catholic view, there's both Mary is virgin born and then Jesus is virgin born. And Mary has a perpetual virginity. She never has sexual relations with Joseph, her husband. And in the Roman Catholic view, that perpetual virginity continues until her death. And it's not just the Roman Catholic. You find even Luther and Calvin holding to that view. So there's something to it, but even if there is that, I don't think that the book of the Song of Solomon is about Mary. There's no mention of Mary in the book. Song of Solomon is one of the very few books of the Old Testament that is never quoted in the New Testament. So it's a quirky book in that sense as well. Then there's a dramatic interpretation, and that is, some argue that this is a play with 2 or 3 different characters. It's obvious who the 2 characters might be, a man and his wife, but the 3 characters are a little bit more difficult, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And then the last view that we find about the book of the Song of Solomon is that this is a wedding song. Some work has gone into what happened at Jewish weddings, and this argues that this is a sort of a liturgy of marriage, and that this is the kind of thing that brides and grooms would sing to one another at their wedding. And then in the last view is that this is a love song. This is the simplest, and I think the best interpretation, that this is very simply a love song between 2 characters, the character of Solomon and the character of a woman whom he found to be particularly beautiful. And that shouldn't stun us. I mean, Solomon was, after all, a man who was taken with a lot of women's beauty, and it created for him a variety of problems, as you remember when we talked about his kingship. In terms of the allegorical interpretation, which is one that is favored in a lot of evangelical circles, usually allegory will give some hints that it's not to be taken literally. And yet we don't find any of those hints in the Song of Solomon. So, for example, a book that is clearly allegory is the book by John Bunyan. It's the book of the Pilgrim's Progress. And you remember that in the Pilgrim's Progress, which is an allegory, there are hints that the book is not to be taken literally. Pilgrim gets caught in a doubting castle. And in the doubting castle, he begins to doubt the goodness of God. And it creates problems for him. He goes through a place called Vanity Fair, never knowing, Bunyan, that it would turn into a word which is the name of a magazine in the United States today. In Bunyan's time, he named the place Vanity Fair because it was the worst of all places, a fair where nothing but vanity was applied to anyone's life. So I think that the simplest is the best way to take this particular book. But if we're to follow the dramatic interpretation, we have to then ask the question, who are these three characters that are being spoken about? One of them is that the young woman probably needed to work for her family. You remember that she is brought in, and the theory under this view, the theory is that she's brought in by Solomon into the royal castle, and yet she is darkly tanned because she has worked outside. We see that in the first chapter. She said, my brothers made me tend the vineyards, and don't look down upon me because of the darkness of my skin. So that's a young woman probably made to work for her family who had a tan from being outside. Keep in mind that during these times, if one were richer, then you didn't have a tan. And the reason was you didn't have to work outside. It was seen as a point of privilege to not be tanned because you didn't have to go outside and work like a regular person did. And it's interesting that today, people today think of tanning as being tan as beautiful, and that certainly wasn't the way that it was during this time. But the second character is a young man, perhaps a shepherd, we don't know for sure, with whom the young woman is in love. And so Solomon, being the powerful person that he is, simply sees this young woman and brings her to the castle, the palace, and thinks to himself, I will certainly be able to win her over with my riches and all that I have here at the palace. And so Solomon tries, having an eye for beautiful women as he did, having, hundreds of wives and concubines. He takes her into his harem and he attempts to win her love. This comports with what we know of Solomon. That's the kind of person that he was. Now, this is not my view of the text. I think that it's hard to make this work, this with three characters. I think that you have to sort of shoehorn some things in that oughtn't to be shoehorned. But at any rate, I wanted you to be aware that that's the way that some people see the text. Even the late Dr. Warren Wiersbe, who was often very careful in his Bible teaching, saw this as the three-character view of the text. But we can ask ourselves another question, and that is, why would the Bible have a love song, right? Let's say that this really is a love song between a man and his wife. Why would the Bible have that in there? It's not about God. It's not about the Jesus. It's a poem of love between a man and his wife. Why would the Bible have that? Well, one of the things that we can realize is that The Bible is meant to serve as a guide to all aspects of our life. There's nothing wrong with sex in marriage. The Bible is very clear about that. Now, one of the problems that we find, and it starts in the early church, some would say it starts with Augustine. I'm not an Augustine scholar. My person in the office next to me is. And Augustine just had some strange views about sex. And one of the reasons is that Augustine had a concubine with whom he lived and had a child, and he had lived with her for 9 years. Augustine became a Christian, and his mother said, "The concubine is not worthy of you. You need to send her away." And so he does. He sends her away. And in all of Augustine's writings, and I mean there are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of the writings of Augustine, there is never the mention of the name of who this concubine was. Some will argue that it's disrespect on the part of Augustine. Others will argue that it was a measure of protection, that Augustine was hated by many who were not Christians, and if they knew who that girl was, they would have killed her or harmed her in some way as a way of getting back at Augustine. We don't know any of that for sure, but Augustine did have some issues with, he didn't even want to be in the same room alone with his sister. So he had some things, and you can read in the Confessions and work all that out for yourself. But we shouldn't think that the Bible teaches us that sex is wrong. In fact, one of the commands of God that in general people often really do want to fulfill is the command, go out, multiply, and fill the earth. That's a command that people do even who've never read the Bible. And so in general, the reason that people were married in the ancient Near East was so that they could have children, and those children could have children, and their tribe or their people got larger and larger. So the text teaches by example that love between this couple, the man and the woman, is exclusive and binding. That's one of the reasons that I think the three-character view doesn't work, is that if that's really the way that we're to read the book, then it doesn't teach us about love being exclusive and binding. It teaches us about some wickedness of Solomon, which is fair, but I don't think that's what it means to teach. It means to teach that love is valid and beautiful even in a fallen world. It's not sex that is wrong, but the misuse and the abuse of it. And I think that one of the problems with the Roman Catholic Church is this idea that the priest should never be married. I think that it brings with it some, not for every priest, of course, but it can bring with it some significant problems that we have seen. And I don't mean to single out the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, obviously enough, anyone who's been watching the news even this week knows that there are so-called evangelicals and former presidents of so-called evangelical schools who have not acted in any way like they should have, and they do not have the celibacy of the Roman Catholic Church to blame it on. But what we should come to realize is that there's nothing wrong with love between a man and a woman themselves, a husband and a wife, but misuse and abuse of sexuality is terribly wrong. And so the book doesn't turn sex into some kind of a sacred ritual, as many of the religions of the day did. There were religions of the day that there were fertility cults where if you needed to have a child, you would go to this fertility cult, and often there would be one particular person there who would make sure that you got pregnant. And there was religious prostitution. You remember, before Paul was ever there, the city of Corinth there was a temple there where they had 1,000 cultic priestesses who were engaged in religious prostitution. The Song of Solomon doesn't turn this into that kind of a thing at all. It simply tells us that love between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, there's nothing wrong with that. So that is, I think, the theme of the book, that marital love between a man and a woman is a gift from God, and it's a gift to be celebrated. You might, if you are a Roman Catholic, or if you've ever been a Roman Catholic, or if you have been around a Roman Catholic, you might realize that in the Roman Catholic's view, sex, even if you're married, other than to procreate, is wrong. So if you are having sex with your wife or husband for any other reason than to have a child, then that's sinful. It seems to me that the Song of Solomon speaks against that by clearly telling us that sex is something to be celebrated when it is between a man and a woman who are married. The book may have been written by Solomon. That's the tradition. And if that is the date when it was written, it dates back to probably the 10th century BC. And as I've already spoken to you, some have dated it later than that, but we won't get into that because it's more than you need to or probably want to know. One of the things that we notice is in the book, Solomon, or whomever wrote it, mentions a variety of different things. He mentions these different places, and the places are in both northern and southern Israel. And this has led some to argue that the book was written before Israel broke, before there was a division of the kingdoms, Judah and Israel. And if that's the case, then the book would have been written during Solomon's time, because after Solomon died and was no longer king, that's when the great division happens. And you couldn't write about these places as if they were all one country, because they weren't at that point. In terms of the outline of the book, you have the courtship in the first part of it, chapter 1 through the 5th verse of chapter 3. Then you have the wedding taking place in chapter 3 through chapter 5:1, the first verse of chapter 5. Then you have the marriage itself, and then an epilogue after the marriage. The marriage itself is where we get to some of what might be thought of as fairly explicit, certainly not explicit in our culture or in our day. It's certainly not explicit in that sense. And it certainly wouldn't have been explicit even in the time that it was written. We think sometimes that we live in the wickedest generation in the world. But I was reading, this has been 20 years ago now, I just happened to be reading Cicero for something that I was working on, and I came across a line in Cicero that said, "Chastity is simply proof of ugliness." And I thought, that sounds like a line that we would hear from a comic today. But it was, many, many, many years ago. And that shows us that there's always been a misuse of sex. There's always been a misunderstanding of sex. But that doesn't mean that it is absolutely wrong. There's a good use of it. There are problems with the book. I'll just mention them quickly. One of them is that there's no mention of God. And that's just very interesting. We talked a little bit about that in an earlier lesson where we talked about the book of Ruth and Boaz and how God shows up there. We talked about it in Esther, where there is no name of God, but God's providence is very clearly seen in the book of Esther. And we talked clearly about the fact that there are times when God appears even though his name is not mentioned. That's clear in the book of Esther. God's name is mentioned in the book of Ruth, but he's there working all these little things out. But no mention of God in the book of the Song of Solomon, which is an unusual thing. And for some, the sexual images are too explicit. There have been some who have argued that even early on, in terms of canonization, there were some who argued that this kind of sexual explicitness should not be in the book of the Bible. But the Song of Solomon, really, it serves as a reminder to all of us that God rejoices in his handiwork, and he knows how to invest it with a thrilling beauty that deserves a full and proper appreciation. You will see in the book, if you read it, and it's not a long book, you will see that both the husband and the wife, the male and the female, speak about the beauty of their mate and compare the beauty of their mate to other things. And it's a wonderful thing, and it teaches us that there is a proper place for the appreciation of the beauty of the opposite sex. Other questions to consider, that is, things that we should think about as we just finish up this book of the Song of Solomon. One is, what are some wrong attitudes toward love and sexuality? And how does the Song of Songs correct them? We see the wrong attitudes toward love and sexuality all over the place. In every 7-Eleven, every commercial, not every, but virtually many commercials pander to the wrong use of love and sexuality. A second thing to consider is, how has God's creation of humanity as male and female made life richer for us? You remember the story of Aristotle is the one who writes about this, that originally male and female were one person, and that they were cut in half, and that we're always, whenever we're unmarried, we're looking for our proper half. And people who've been married for 30 or 40 years will often call their spouse their better half. That harkens back, even though they may not know it, to that idea of Aristotle that we were once one and we were cut in half, and now we're looking for the one with whom we ought to be. A third sort of question that we can consider is, what can we learn about maintaining a healthy and faithful love relationship, both in courtship and in marriage? And how should the bride and the groom treat one another and express their love for one another? And you'll find that laid out for you very clearly in the book of the Song of Solomon. Here, just because I happen to love old manuscripts, you'll see this is a picture of what is called the Aleppo Codex, and it has the Song of Solomon, the complete book of the Song of Solomon, written in Hebrew in it. And you will find a variety of things here. You can look this image up on the internet, and you'll find little notes down at the bottom where they're not sure what the reading should be. You'll find things off to the side where they're making certain corrections or clarifying things. It's a fascinating thing to look at ancient manuscripts and realize that this is a book that was written before the printing press, and someone took the time to write all of this down just so that we could have a Bible. So, at the end of the book of the Song of Solomon, at the end of our study, we should think about the fact that the groom says to the bride, "You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you." And that's the way that we ought to think of our spouses. that we ought to think of them as altogether beautiful and not having a flaw. And that will keep marriages together rather than creating problems and creating issues and creating divorce and the illicit kind of behavior that we see in churches today. If nothing else that we can learn from the book of Song of Solomon, we can learn that when people are married, they should exhibit their love for one another and make sure that they speak of their love for one another, just as Christ himself has spoken of his love for us. So it's a difficult book, the Song of Solomon, a lot of different questions we could think about. Next week we'll be looking at the book of Isaiah. We'll be looking at the great major prophet Isaiah, who has a lot of wonderful things to say to us. Just pick any chapter of Isaiah and you will find beautiful writing and marvelous things that God has to say to his people. So we'll look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll look forward to studying the great prophet of Isaiah together. Until then, I hope that this study of the book of Song of Solomon has been helpful to you, and may you be blessed by the Lord and by his church. Thanks for watching from Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. We'll see you next week.